Good morning, River of Life Community Fellowship. It is time for our Wednesday edition of Sunday School, where we get to have short daily devotions since we can't meet for Sunday School. And this week we're going through some of my favorite verses. And today we're going to be talking about Ephesians 3:8. I'm going to read that here for you right now. It says, Paul writing, "To me, though I am the very least of all the saints, this grace was given, to preach to the Gentiles the unsearchable riches of Christ." I love that verse, and what always stands out to me about that verse every time I read it or even think about it is that this is Paul. This is Paul writing, and Paul, the Apostle Paul, says, "And though I am the very least of all of the saints." Now this is Paul, who was God's mouthpiece to the Gentiles, who founded dozens of churches all across the Roman Empire, who wrote 2/3 of what we now call the New Testament. This is the Apostle Paul. The Catholics call him a saint. Like he is not insignificant, and he is one of the most famous Christians ever. And here he says, "Though I am the very least of all of the saints." And it's just what stands out to me about that is, like for many of us, we would consider him one of the greatest of God's followers, one of the best. And but here in the Word of God, he says, "Though I am the least of all the saints." And it's in the Word of God, so it has to be true, right? But why would he say that? And that's the part that always catches me. Why would Paul say that? And I think I've come to the understanding of this kind of through the years is the reason that Paul says that is because Paul has experienced God's grace in ways that even at this time and even now very few have, is he was decidedly against the church. He persecuted and sought to kill people who followed Christ. And so, but then God rescued him from that. God pointed himself out. God showed himself to Paul, and Paul came to the conclusion and the understanding that not only was Christ the Messiah, he was also the Son of God and God himself. And so, like Paul had this background, and even as after he came to Christ and go through his life, we read in Corinthians that he says that he had this thorn in his side that he asked God to remove, and 3 times, and God said, "No, my grace is sufficient for you." So we kind of glean from that he still struggled with things. He still struggled with sin, like we all do. But because he had experienced God's grace, and because he had been drawn closer and closer to God through his faith and through seeking God and doing the things that God had called him to do, because he had drawn close to God like that, his sin was all the more evident to him. Because that's what happens in our lives. When we come face to face with God, when we come into God's presence, our unworthiness becomes painfully obvious. It becomes so very obvious to us. And that's what Paul was experiencing here, that he was just not worthy. Like his sin was such a stark contrast to the goodness of who God is. And so his sin really pointed out to him that he was kind of a bad person, that he didn't measure up. He wasn't very good. And so as he saw this reflection of who God is and compared that to his own life, he said, I'm the least of all God's people. And that's kind of, I think, important for us to understand as we go through life. Like if we're drawing closer to God, we're going to look at our lives and say, this isn't very good. Like the things that are in our lives that are wrong, that are contrary to God, are going to become more and more evident the closer we get to God. And like that's going to make us feel like, we're the worst sinner ever. And that's a good thing. In his letter to the Corinthians, the 2 Corinthians, Paul called that remorse that leads to life, grief that leads to life, because it shows us our need for God so that we draw closer to God. And that's a good thing. One of the other things in this verse is, Paul says he's the least, and his life doesn't reflect the things of God that it should, that he falls so very short of what God calls him to. But nonetheless, God has given him a grace. God has given him grace and allowed him to be a part of the amazing things that God was doing. And that it's the same for us. As we grow closer and closer to God, our sin becomes more evident, but so does God's grace. God's ability to not give us what we deserve, his ability to show us mercy and to give us grace, to not hold us accountable for the things we deserve to be accountable for. And God shows that grace to us and allows us to be a part of his kingdom and a part of his plan and a part of his work. And that's a great thing. And that's one of the things I love about this verse is there's just such that contrast. The closer we get to God, the more we realize our sin, but the closer we get to God, the more we experience his grace. And that is a powerful, powerful thing. So here's my challenge to you today is, what are the things in your life that God is showing you that make you feel like you're the least of all God's people? And how are you seeing God's grace through that? And if you've had a time in your life when you've come across this sin and you're like, oh, this is horrible, but God has still shown you grace and allowed you to be a part of his kingdom, allowed you to do his work, I'd like you to put that in the comments, because it is, as we talk about the things that God has done in our lives, it builds our faith and it builds the faith of the people who listen. So I encourage you, put that in the comments wherever you're watching this video. Let us know how you've seen God's grace show up in your life, even though you feel like you're the least of all God's people. So with that, that's all I have for today. I hope and pray that God is blessing you, and I hope that you get to experience his grace today. Thanks, and God bless.